Good afternoon, everybody. That's what I was looking for. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I appreciate your being here. It's rare we get an opportunity to address a topic that's both intellectually provocative and urgent, but also is something that I think we're obligated to address on the ground in a very concrete way as well as in a deeply theoretical and abstract way. So we're going to do all the above this afternoon in what I promise you will be a fleeting 2 hours. We have three of my good friends and some of the most important intellectuals that I know in the country and in the world to talk about this topic this afternoon. And they're going to talk in reverse order of what's on the flyer. As you know, we're here for an event entitled Beyond the School to Prison Pipeline, Radical Perspectives on Criminalization and State Violence Across State Institutions. So what brings us here is the following. How many of y'all heard of the school to prison pipeline as an idea? Right? It's become a more and more common sense idea. We just spent 5 hours before this panel discussing it in a critical sense, talking about how the foundation apparatus, the federal government, schools, school districts have seized on this paradigm to start shaping political agendas, to start shaping and restricting activism, and I think most importantly, to repress radical political work, particularly that being taken up by young people, black youth, brown youth, and others. So what we have our three scholars here to address is a radical critique of that paradigm, school to prison pipeline. What we want to understand is where it came from, what the problems are with it, and then to start thinking globally about the implications of treating state institutions as criminalizing sites writ large. In other words, we don't just need to talk about prisons and the courts as criminalizing institutions. We need to think about places like schools and, yes, universities as criminalizing sites. We have three speakers this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be speaking. First, let me present to you Connie Wun. Connie Wun will be giving us thoughts on a paper entitled Zero Tolerance Policies as Excess, Race and Gender in School, Discipline, and Punishment. Connie Wun is a doctoral student in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. She's worked as a former high school teacher, sexual assault counselor, and anti-youth violence advocate for more than a decade, and I've known her for almost 20 years. Her research focuses on the politics of school discipline and punishment, racial and gender violence, psychoanalysis, and critical theory in education. She's currently working on a study of school discipline policies and their effects on female high school students of color. Our second speaker will be Damien Sojoyner. He'll be giving us a paper entitled Undoing the Myth of the School to Prison Pipeline. Professor Sojoyner is an assistant professor in the Intercollegiate Department of Africana Studies within the Claremont College Consortium. Prior to this, he was a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Black Studies at UC Santa Barbara, where he worked closely with Cedric Robinson. He researches the relationship among the public education system, prisons, and the construction of black masculinity in Southern California. He's written articles in scholarly journals such as Race, Education, and Ethnicity, Transforming Anthropology, and most recently in Black California Dreamin', published by the University of California Press. He's currently finishing his book manuscript, which promises to be groundbreaking, entitled First Strike, Schools, Prisons, and Black Masculinity, to be published by Duke University Press. And I'll say, from where I sit, it's one of the manuscripts I anticipate coming out most urgently in the 12 years I've been a professor. Our third and final speaker will be my good friend and collaborator, my partner in crime, Professor Jacques Costa Vargas. He'll be giving us a paper entitled Borrowed Land as Prison, Spectacles of Homeland Warfare in Rio de Janeiro. Many of us in the room have read his work, right? So in some ways I feel as if it's almost an insult to introduce him in the limited way I will. But for those of us in the room that have read his work, we know the impact his work has had on us in shaping how we think and quite literally how we live. So forgive this bare presentation of his biography. He insisted on it. Professor Vargas is Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. He's affiliated with Women and Gender Studies and Latin American Studies. He's the author of two books, along with many articles. His first book, published in 2006, is entitled Catching Hell in the City of Angels, Life and Meanings of Blackness in South Central Los Angeles. His second book, which I have to say based on my own politics and pedagogy, has rapidly become required reading for many of the students who enter my classrooms. Published in 2010, is entitled Never Meant to Survive, Genocide and Utopias in Black Diaspora Communities. Can you help me welcome our three speakers, please? So with that, let me introduce Connie Wun. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So let me first thank the Critical Ethnic Studies Research Center, the Center for Ideas and Society. I don't see Laura here, but I wanted to thank her for organizing it and or doing the logistics, and of course, Dylan Rodríguez for organizing us and putting us together. We spent quite a bit of time early this morning up until now thinking this really important thing through with a bunch of other people as well. So thank you very, very much. So I also like to thank Damien. You saw a version of this when we were in Puerto Rico for another conference. And a couple of other people helped me to read this through at Berkeley, Francisco Cacique, and then my little sister also read a version of this paper. And thank you all for being here. And to give you another kind of backdrop to this paper, there were several, it's about a high school, and there were several shootings and deaths of Black and Latino students. And I didn't want to highlight necessarily their deaths or their injuries. In fact, I wanted to highlight the contexts by which these deaths and these shootings were made possible. Throughout the United States, students of color, particularly Black and Latino youths, are more often disciplined in the forms of referrals, suspensions, and expulsions, and are more often policed and arrested than their counterparts. According to a report issued by the Department of Justice, Latino students constitute 24% of the population, 29% of law enforcement referrals, 37% of school-related arrests, and 24% of the expulsion data. While Black youth make up 18% of the student population, they constitute 42% of the referrals to law enforcement, 35% of school-related arrests, and 39% of all students expelled. These disparities mirror those found in incarceration rates. As my broader dissertation project argues, the U.S. culture of discipline and punishment has been largely imagined as limited to legal codes, court proceedings, and the formal spaces that make up a prison, jail, or detention center. This misguided imagination belies, as Foucault reminds us, how these policies are emblematic of larger cultural shifts toward a repressive politics of discipline and punish, which, for so many, have shaped and resulted in the interruption and/or destruction of everyday life. One exemplary social institution through which this can be seen is the public education system. Though my larger dissertation work broadly examines the complex relationships of an increasingly punitive U.S. culture of discipline and punishment with public schools, today's talk will focus narrowly on only one thread: how school discipline policies have been used and are understood in regards to the educational sphere, and what the implications of these mechanisms have been for the physical and emotional worlds of young Black women. Putting Black girls at the center of analysis compels us to examine the underlying logics of discipline and punishment as they relate to the dominant social order marked by anti-Blackness. So let me begin by briefly defining a few terms. I use discipline and punishment in specific ways. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the early definition of discipline is one that implies the instruction, education, or training of a subject or object. We see in this early definition of discipline an educative component. Increasingly, however, the mode of teaching has fallen away from instruction or education closer towards a custodial relationship. Here, discipline in the modern sense has shifted to become, quote, the training of habits of order and subordination to bring under control, to deal with or treat of in an orderly manner, unquote. This definition of discipline appears to carry militaristic and punitive undertones. These undertones, which are pervasive in large society, have been embedded ideologically as well as physically, in our public primary education school system. In these schools, discipline also takes on another dimension of punishment, specifically in relationship to Black youth. Punishment is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as maltreatment, injury, damage, and rough handling, which includes dimensions of pain and suffering. Culture theorist and Black studies scholar Jared Sexton specifies that within the context of New World anti-Blackness, punishment is primary and foundational to Black subjection, with discipline as a popular theater of cruelty. In other words, discipline is in excess to a condition that is structurally positioned as always susceptible to and is a subject of punishment. As education policy continues to inch closer to legal policy and codes and the attendant logics of incarceration or imprisonment, students, particularly young Black students, are both disciplined and punished. Often scholars and researchers have conflated discipline and punishment, missing opportunities to tease the two mechanisms apart. The task of closely examining discipline and punishment, I argue, is particularly important as we attempt to examine what has been called the overrepresentation of Black youth in school discipline data. Current interrogations of the disciplinary landscapes that affect and shape the schooling experiences of working poor, working class students have narrowed in on the disparities in zero tolerance policies. While it is useful to examine the uneven rates of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, locating zero tolerance policies as the locus for disciplinary discrepancies misses everyday occurrences of punishment for which Black students, particularly young Black females, are subject. In the past few years, public schools and districts in the United States that serve predominantly working class, working poor students of color have been scrutinized for their over-reliance upon zero tolerance policies as the main form of student management and school order. Zero tolerance is reserved for policies, or the title zero tolerance, is reserved for policies that have mandated the immediate suspension and or expulsion of students for a list of infractions not limited to drug and weapons possession. Some researchers have expanded zero tolerance to incorporate the use of school-based arrests. While many have traced the development of these disciplinary policies and practices to the Guns Free Schools Act of 1994, which mandated the immediate expulsion of a student found in possession of a gun within 1,000 feet from a school campus, the genealogy of zero tolerance policies reaches back to at least the late 1960s, as a response to political protest, purported claims of high rates of crime in schools, and school integration at large. In the early 1970s, particularly in California, the criminal justice system and education system joined efforts to increase policing and surveillance as instituted forms of crime control and discipline in schools. For instance, in 1973, the California Department of Justice published the first edition of Law in the School, a guide explicitly intended for California teachers, parents, and students that outlined the responsibilities that school and law enforcement officials held in the enforcement of law in schools. According to the introduction, while teachers are neither parents nor policemen, they have assumed two duties, which they share in common with parents and policemen. Their first duty is to take affirmative action to see to it that each child is protected from the harm caused by crimes and disciplinary offenses committed by other students, by outsiders, and even by the child himself. Failing this, their second duty is to use disciplinary and, if necessary, criminal processes to deal effectively and impartially with misbehavior. 10 years later, in 1984, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Attorney General created the School Law Enforcement Partnership. This partnership between schools and law enforcement was created under the auspices that it was their duty to create safe and orderly campuses and communities as required by the state constitution. The narrative of safety helped to create, if not legitimize, the need to join two institutions in governing the school environment. This resulted in a series of institutional policies that authorized and mandated school officials to police and discipline students under the legal concept of safety in schools. These policies and legislative rulings provide the foundation and legitimize the mechanisms of surveillance, searches, and seizures used to discipline students suspected of criminal behavior. More directly, these policies and legal rulings deputized school officials with legal rights to police and discipline students. These legally authorized performances of zero tolerance have had disastrous effects and deleterious outcomes for young, working class, working poor Black students. Studies demonstrate that Black youth are disproportionately subject to referrals, suspensions, and expulsions based primarily on subjective standards more than any other racial group. Although these studies make vital contributions to the field of educational inequality, they have not captured the more common experiences of Black students have when confronting authority figures that are beyond the scope of reasonable suspicion or probable cause and are not encapsulated within the rubric of zero tolerance. Current conceptualizations and investigations surrounding racial disparities in suspensions, expulsions, referrals, and arrests, I argue, elude and steer observations away from more quotidian forms of discipline and punishment that are enacted upon Black youth, particularly young Black school-aged girls in school settings. And this is reinforced through that partnership between the criminal justice and school system. For instance, in 2010, the Department of Justice and Office of Education joined efforts to examine the overrepresentation of students of color in rates of arrests, suspensions, and expulsions. These dominant narratives regarding inequalities in school discipline obscures and disables the structural analyses of intersecting and overlapping layers of discipline and punishment that shape the experiences of young Black women at school in particular and society at large. Research indicates that young Black women are twice as likely as their white female counterparts to be sent to the office and are 5 times as likely to be suspended or expelled. As well, according to a study, from 2002 to 2006, per district suspension rates for Black girls increased by 5.6%, compared to 1.7% for Black boys. Young Black women are also more likely to experience these zero tolerance policies than their white and Asian American male counterparts, and all other female racial groups, including whites, Latinas, and Asian Americans. This data helps to highlight the particular relationship that Black girls have to these disciplinary mechanisms. At the same time, they miss students' day-to-day experiences with punishment that actually undergird and are reinforced by zero tolerance policies in ways that have not been monitored or archived. My preliminary fieldwork has been the impetus for this observation, so let me provide a few examples to help illustrate the need to broaden analyses of school discipline away from narrowed conceptualizations of zero tolerance. It would be useful to turn the analytic and sympathetic gaze towards quotidian forms of punishment that are critical to the experiences of young Black women in schools. In September 2012, I began my preliminary research at a high school located in a suburb wedged between 2 major urban cities in the Bay Area. Unlike many of the suburbs, or what is imagined to be the composite of suburban communities, this city is comprised of working class, working poor communities of color, mostly Asian American, Filipino, Filipino American, and Latinos. After meeting with the principal, a white woman in her mid-40s, about my project on race, gender, and discipline, I was directed to several teachers and classes that she thought might be helpful to my dissertation. For the purposes of this paper, I'd like to share 3 stories from the fieldwork. In one meeting, I observed a 9th grade all-Black female life skills class. Since the school's inception, this has been the first of its kind and was created purportedly in response to Black girls' disciplinary problems. It is important to note that most of the girls in this class have not had any discipline records. Thus, it was a preventative course. This class meeting took place during the 5th week of school when students had become a bit more comfortable with each other and the teacher. Based upon the teacher's concern that the students were talking over one another, she started this class meeting by asking, "Why should students respect this class?" Students began to shout out answers such as, "Because this class is fun, I can be with my friends, I feel comfortable in here." And suddenly, one student expressed that, in this class, I don't get in trouble for everything. The teacher asked her to elaborate. She explained that she hated all of her classes because it seemed as though anytime she did anything, she'd get into trouble. In particular, her Spanish teacher, which other students echoed was a problem for them as well, would get mad at her for chewing gum, for laughing, for talking, for acting as if she was talking. Apparently, these experiences were not limited to one teacher or a couple of girls. And another student explained that she once spent an entire class period standing outside of class because she had been chewing gum. These girls experienced forms of policing and surveillance that did not register under the current conceptualizations of zero tolerance. That is, they were not suspended, expelled, or arrested, but their days were often filled with these punitive encounters, including the threat of them. In the following week, I interviewed 2 senior black female students who were teaching assistants for the 9th grade class. In the interview, I learned about the different layers of emotional and physical challenges that afflicted the girls, the ways in which they were policed and rendered structurally vulnerable to authorities and their peers. When I asked the girls what young women get into trouble for doing on campus, they shared a story about a recently created faux Instagram account that was being circulated around campus. I don't know if you guys know what Instagram is. For those of you who don't know, Instagram is an online photo album that is part of the social networking world. And in this faux Instagram account, there were at least 30 young women featured in this online montage of photos, most of whom were black female students. Although it is already a major concern that pictures of these adolescent girls were circulated online without their consents, each picture was accompanied by a caption that detailed personal details of the student's life. In one case, one of the pictures included a caption that detailed true intimate stories about her family and experience with sexual assault. The girls explained that many black female students were extremely upset by this Instagram account, especially because they were unable to hold anyone accountable and did not receive enough support from teachers or administrators. Although according to one student, an administrator claimed that Instagram was contacted, but were unable to assist in stopping the circulation. The online exhibition of the girls' images became the impetus for searing tensions among many of the girls they knew on campus. The young women featured on the account tried to find the owner, sometimes wrestling with each other and becoming suspicious of one another. There were at least 3 fights that ensued because of this account. Girls with pictures posted online began confronting other girls they suspected of unscrupulously posting pictures of them. According to the girls, friends who were involved in these fights were suspended, and those who actively confronted other girls in search of the Instagram account holder found themselves threatened with arrest by administrators. The students from my interview explained that many of the girls felt helpless. There were few options, if any, for how they could defend themselves and assert their agency. At the time, they were also confronted with the constant threat of discipline and punishment. In the 3rd meeting, 1 week later, I guest lectured in an 11th grade history class on gender, discipline, and violence. There were 33 students in this diverse classroom. Most students were Latino, Filipino, Filipino-American, and Asian American. In this classroom, white and black students were the minority. I asked the students to tell me what they thought were the rules on campus. They listed a range of ideas, including fights, cutting class, selling candy for their own money, and public displays of affection. While each rule they listed was interesting, I decided to begin with fighting. I asked the students to tell me why students fought. I asked who got into these fights, and the students, both males and females, replied that boys and girls did, but lately, more girls were fighting. A young male explained, "Girls fight on campus the most. Boys, we fight off campus." According to the young men, who initially dominated the classroom discussion, girls fought because they were dramatic and thirsty for attention. One male student brought up the Instagram conflict. When I asked what the students thought about the Instagram issue, a few male students explained that it was not a big deal. I asked if the girls agreed. Many non-black students nodded as an affirmation. Then one black female student, who was the teacher's assistant, retorted quietly and defensively, "It's not a big deal to you because you're not involved." It was as if she and the women from my previous interview existed in a separate sphere from those of their peers. Her proclamation was left unaddressed by the other students. Instead, they ignored her and continued to say that the Instagram was over drama. Girls like drama. One Filipino-American male student explained that boys get into fights over social networking too, but not like girls. Girls, he explained, never know how to let things go. The wave of accusations about girls and their needs for attention picked up again, or rather never stopped, until a young South Asian man casually yelled out, "They get into fights to pull each other's weaves." His neighboring classmates burst into laughter. Surprised by this statement, I approached him to ask him to repeat himself. He shook his head. Another male student answered in his place. He said, "The girls fight to pull their weaves out." It was the first racial signifier, a black female signifier, that was entered into the conversation, one that gave more specificity to who it was they were vehemently accusing of being thirsty for attention. According to him, the girls who liked drama were young black women. I turned to look at the TA whose attempt to intervene had fallen to the wayside. She didn't look up. The teacher, who identifies as Filipino-American and African-American, shook her head in what seemed to be a sign of dismay or resignation. I repeated the young man's statement and asked if other students found what he said to be funny. The question was apparently taken to be a rhetorical one, or perhaps the students had changed their minds. The class went silent. A black female student who had been quiet up until the last 10 minutes of class said, "Maybe the girls fight because they're vulnerable." I asked her to expound on her comment. Maybe something is happening at home, somewhere, and they're angry. She explained that the girls were vulnerable to judgment and violence at home and in society. I turned to the rest of the class to ask, "What do you think makes a girl vulnerable?" The once clamorous classroom stayed silent. It was as if imagining, engaging, or even empathizing with the vulnerability of their young black female peer had been an unfathomable option to this predominantly non-black student population. These girls existed in another part of the world, a sphere of vulnerability that was peripheral to their classmates but could operate as a premise for joint social laughter. Most research on school discipline policies, particularly zero-tolerance policies, have focused on black and Latino boys. While this research is extremely necessary, there is limited research on discipline policies disaggregated by gender and race. This glaring absence in research exists in spite of data that demonstrate that girls of color, specifically black females, are overrepresented in federal discipline data. The focus on zero-tolerance policies, while important, also eludes a critical analysis, one that centers the social order, that positions black girls as receptacles for racist and misogynistic projections. Put differently, the dominant discourses on school discipline disparities obscure a structural condition that positions black girls within a context and space where their lives are illegible and inconsequential. Little credit is given to her when she tries to understand and navigate through this reality. Instead of implicating the different contexts that may propel her to act out, including the racial gendered phobic impulse to characterize the child as a problem and as dramatic, or perhaps supporting her acts of agency, she is punished and disciplined. Put differently, again, her vulnerability and desire for attention, real or imagined, are premises for criminalization and grounds for punishment. In the efforts to address school discipline policies and their effects, Perhaps we should start reconceptualizing how we understand and critique discipline in schools by centering the dominant social order and world that authorizes and executes everyday forms of discipline and punishment that are institutionalized into policy and are ingrained in daily encounters of anti-Blackness. It is within the seemingly mundane, in the affect, in the jokes, in the hypersurveillance of her body. I return to Sexton. This is the world that positions young Black girls as structurally vulnerable to layers of violence, including appropriation, perpetual and involuntary openness, including all the wanton uses of her body. This is the type of world that the young Black female teaching assistant angrily accused her peers of not understanding, which not only fell on their deaf ears, but was readily dismissed. This is the type of world that deputizes an anti-Black multicultural society and its members to discipline and punish her. Zero tolerance policies, that is, suspensions and expulsions, referrals and arrests, are in excess to a type of anti-Black disciplining and punishment that is so much more ordinary. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Professor Damien Sojoyner. Could you please welcome Professor Sojoyner?
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dylan Rodríguez, Professor Rodríguez, for organizing all of us coming together today. I'd also like to thank Connie. We've been having lots of discussions about this issue along with Dylan and Jerome Vargas, who hammered a lot of these ideas into my head a while ago. Also like to thank Yusuf Omawali, who is the director of the Southern California Library, who's sitting right back there. He and I have been talking about this issue of schools and prisons for a long time, and he's opened my mind to a lot of these ideas and also the archival resources that are available at the Southern California Library are just something that you can't find anywhere else just about in the world. So that's a little shameless plug for the library as well. So this issue of the school to prison pipeline has been a big one. We talked about it this morning, about the framework coming around in 2003, organized by a symposium through the Civil Rights Project at Harvard and Institute for Race and Justice from Northwestern. They had a symposium, and from that came this language of the school to prison pipeline. Now, the idea had been around for a while, but it really gets solidified at this meeting. Now, a big problem with this, the language of the school to prison pipeline is that it is very simple. It makes sense. You know, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. Students act up, get kicked out of school, they get sent to prison. However, if anything makes that much sense that fast, then you should really think about it because it's highly problematic. That's what I've learned talking with all these good people. In particular, what I want to discuss today are three major ways in which the school to prison pipeline, both as a framework in terms of policy initiatives and then also conceptually, is highly problematic. The first is historically. It's just a complete erasure of history. And what I mean by that is that if you listen to what the people who advocate for the school to prison pipeline say, is that the main problem is that these issues of students getting suspended, expelled, and sent to prison, if we just get rid of these discipline policies, then we won't have these problems anymore, and then so on and so forth, right? But if you go back and look to why or how it is that police actually got into schools, then you'll understand it's much more nuanced than that. And what I mean by that is, who in here is from LA? All right, cool. So we'll have some point of reference here. So 1947 at Fremont High School. Y'all know where Fremont High School is? You went to Fremont. All right, so at Fremont High School, there is a major, what they call a race riot. Really what it was white parents and white students started literally attacking black students on campus. In response to this issue, in addition to some other issues that have been going on, black youth organize themselves and form these groups. You guys heard of the Slossons or gladiators? They were later called gangs. And by 1959, there is a body that meets. And this body is people from the urban planning offices, nonprofit groups, and they form what's called the Welfare Planning Council subregion of Southern California. And they come out with this report, which is called Youth Needs and Problems in the South Central Region. And all it discusses and talks about is all of these supposed issues and problems that are going on with black youth in South Central Los Angeles. So who do you think they label as the problem, the number one problem? Who is it? It is the supposed gangs, right? Now this may sound like, oh, this is, of course, because of what you hear about the Crips and Bloods, right? But the whole idea of what I'm trying to convey here is that the labeling of black youth, in particular Crips, Bloods, however you want to say it, as the problem is nothing new. The question is, why did these organizations form? So the Slossons Gladiators form in large part because of organizations. You guys heard of the Spook Hunters by any chance? So the Spook Hunters is an all-white gang that is trying to keep out these sort of like black people moving in from Texas and Louisiana into what they consider to be their neighborhood. So areas such as Whittier, Southgate, big time, Inglewood, all these used to be, surprisingly, you would never know from right now, we used to be all white during this moment in time. So the Gladiators and Slossons form in order to keep, essentially to protect from firebombing, street fights, so on and so forth, right? So instead of the Welfare Planning Council forming to try to look at what are really the issues of what's going on, it's easy to point the finger at whom? The black youth who are just simply trying to protect themselves and their families. Now, what the Welfare Planning Council also realizes is that they have a major problem in terms of there's no control within the schools, and there's no control within the black community from how they see it. And what I mean by control is that these organizations are recruiting from within schools. These organizations are also forming radical ideas of what the world should look like, in large response to what's going on with black people in Los Angeles during that moment in time. And Hugh Main's writes, it's like about a 100-page document called The Problem of the Negro Citizen in Los Angeles. In that, what he details is that from late 1940s through 1965, the LAPD and the LA County Sheriff had an official policy of just cracking black people's heads all throughout Los Angeles. In response to this, black people start to form, organize, and understand that the problem is much more than just having white people and black people come together. There's issues of economics, politics. It's a much more structured apparatus. So the WPC's policy recommendations are that we as being the city of Los Angeles, needs to infiltrate into the schools. So how do you do that is put more counselors within the schools who will teach the ideology that, in fact, the problem is these black gangs. That's A. And the problem also is what they call black hate groups. And what these black hate groups are, of course, is the bubbling up of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles that's beginning to form in the late 1960s. So immediately, what do you think is going to happen? Resistance to this. And resistance comes in which ways? Of black youth themselves and their parents organizing, saying, no, this is not what we see as a solution. So in addition to what happened in 1965 with the Watts Rebellion, I'm just going through history pretty fast there, but in addition to what happened in 1965 with the Watts Rebellion, what you see is a lot of these small incidents happening within schools throughout LA and LA County. So parents are actively saying, our schools are failing. My son or daughter has no idea how to read and write. I don't understand what's going on. And the Los Angeles Sentinel in 1969 issued a piece in which parents did some digging themselves and found that the teachers who were being sent to Fremont, to Jefferson, and to Washington were all of the disgruntled teachers, essentially the teachers who didn't necessarily want to be teaching quote unquote, and they all get sent to teach the black students. Because by this time, Brown v. Board had passed, and you're supposed to have desegregation within schools. But what you have is a system of whereby, of course, white folks, by and large, are beginning to move out of these areas. Schools, there's no way in the world that a white parent is going to send their child to a black school if they can afford it. So formerly white teachers who were teaching at these schools now try to move out as well. But the ones who are supposedly low performing, white parents are like, no, keep them over there, right? Once again, this is quick and dirty glossing of history. It's much more detailed than this. So in addition to this, what you have is the immediate response then, in addition to sort of like this soft-hand policy apparatus, the immediate response to any issue that takes place within schools is police. This completely comes to a head in 1969 at Jefferson High School. There is a fight at a football game between Jefferson and Crenshaw. The response by the LAPD is to send out 1,000 cops to Jefferson High School. So the students at Jefferson High School response is, well, we're going to go on strike. Literally, we're not going to go to school until you remove all the cops from campus. So this becomes a very tense moment. From this point forward, you have cops within schools. Now that's very important because this is before you have the explosion of like prisons on a grand scale. This is before what we would think of as being sort of schools being bad, which is what the school to prison pipeline would have you believe, that simply if we just change these discipline policies, then schools would be okay. But if you go back into the history and look at, schools have been problematic for a long time. So 1969 is a pivotal year, and both happened at Jefferson and Dorsey, but then also the LAPD in conjunction with LAUSD form a program called Police and Government. And what this does, this is piloted at Dorsey High School, and for the very first time, you actually have cops teaching students. And the students have to take, and black, because Jordan at the time was located in Watts, it was primarily black. Students have to take classes in which they're trying to be more or less, as the police officer asks them a series of questions, what they're trying to do is to get them to understand that the police are there for your benefit, that the police are there to help you, the police are there to assist you. They ask questions such as, what do you think is the role of the police? What do you think should happen if there's a riot? Is there ever a good time to have a riot? Stuff like this, right? But then they go through and go through the Bill of Rights. And they say the Bill of Rights, the first article says this, but this is what it means for you. The second article says this, but this is what it means for you. So trying to instill within them this understanding that, yes, you do live in this democratic society, but there are limitations to what it means to be a citizen of the United States. So a lot of this history gets completely glossed over when we don't completely understand why police were in public education in the first place. So it is key to understand that that this is a response to black demands for particular types of freedom that are not being met. And so the answer is not necessarily to just simply remove police from schools, because what you completely don't see is that the reason why police are in schools in the first place is because schools are a primary site for which black organizing has been going on for a long time. W.B. Du Bois talked about this in Black Reconstruction. It's been going on for a long time, and importantly, this struggle is not completely one-sided, which is, I'm getting ahead of myself, is point 3. But let me get back to point number 2, get to point number 2. So the focus then of the school to prison pipeline has been on these issues of behavior and discipline. And when we talk about behavior, implicitly, there are these programs that supposedly come up that will assist students to help them curb their behavior in order not to get caught up in this matrix of discipline. So what you need to do then as a black student within a classroom is behavior modification, so that if something happens to you in school, you shouldn't respond so violently, or you shouldn't yell back at the teacher. All of these, now this sounds like quite laughable and comical if it was not so true. in how black youth are being taught within schools. Of course, what, once again, with the school to prison pipeline model completely ignores is this behavior of which supposedly needs to be modified is the same behavior of black radicalism, which is key in terms of demands for black freedom. So oftentimes people, black youth will respond to something happening in school, in large part, maybe not anything having to do with school, but the fact that they don't have any food at home, or the fact that somebody got laid off a long time ago and now they're on welfare, they just lost welfare, so now people are trying to figure out, where am I going to live tomorrow? These issues undergird what's going on, and that's not being addressed at all. So you focus on behavior and miss the bigger structural problems that are going down. And then lastly, the third part is that the school to prison pipeline is completely top down. It acts as if students, these black youth, are just so helpless. And what I mean by that is that the paradigm from which it looks at is that this big bad school entity is doing all of these things upon these black youth who are just docile bodies. It does not understand, in fact, that black people are not helpless. That the reason why, that this is a response to something else. So in order to understand the reason for sending youth to prison in the first place, you have to understand why prisons were created. The school to prison pipeline doesn't even address prisons, which is quite hilarious. All it discusses and talks about is policing within schools, with no conversation about what is the reason for prison A in the first place, and then B, why is it that prisons look just like schools? Or rather, it should be the other way around, that schools inform how prisons look. But because you have a top-down model, you're acting as if these black people are just taking this and have no agency within this system. So I'm gonna leave it there. I think we talk a lot more in question and answer about it. So.